The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this session, Nothing Beats Zero, updates on the trends and projects that are getting to zero energy. I am Connie Umphris, Communications Manager at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear our speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane on this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. Please ask questions in the question pane as they come up. We will take some questions after the trends section and then again at the end of the presentation. At the end of the webinar session, you will be given the opportunity to take a short survey. I'd like to introduce today's panel, starting with Kathy Higgins. Kathy has over 25 years in energy efficiency strategic planning, research, policy, and large-scale project management. As NBI Research Director, she manages the portfolio of work involving zero net energy buildings, measured performance, emerging technologies, and supports business development. Next up, we will have John Anderay. John is a bioclimatic design leader and principal at Integral Group, where he brings over 30 years of energy-focused consulting experience to the firm. John's work at Integral centers on passive and climate-based architectural and engineering design solutions to improve occupant health, thermal comfort, and energy efficiency in the built environment. John believes that sustainable design is an engineer's social responsibility and has led the design of over 25 zero net energy projects that are currently in design, construction, or occupied. Also joining us from NBI, we have Riley Loveland. Riley supports the project management team on various projects, including the Prop 39 Zero Net Energy School retrofit work in California, as well as other K-12 school-related work. Riley also designs and develops NBI workshops, public engagement materials, and other technical and market transformation resources. Kathy will introduce NBI and start today's conversation. Kathy, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Connie, and welcome to the participants nationally that are joining us for this Getting to Zero webinar. As always, as a small nonprofit, we want to be sure and recognize and appreciate our valued sponsors and partners. You see their logos here, and there's others in addition to the people that sponsor us that we work closely with a large array of allies and clients on projects to help move our work forward. And speaking of our work, I want to be sure and help industry recognize how NBI, as a nonprofit and as a leading institute to move buildings to best practices, how we do our work. And that's through what we call the virtuous cycle. We begin with really drawing from many of you on the phone and allies to look at a vision of what the future should be. We contribute thought leadership, and then the work that I lead in research helps form a foundation that documents and verifies best practices that can then move into solutions both technically with our director Mark Frankel and in codes and policies with our policy director Jim Edelson. The program areas that NBI leads are threefold. We work in innovation for new and existing buildings and programs. We have a very strong code and policy advancement program. And then what you're here today to hear about is our leadership in zero energy buildings and the market development that helps advance those buildings. So thanks again for joining us. So I'm going to open with an update on our 2018 Getting to Zero status report. So in order to do that, it's important to have some common vocabulary. I'm just going to take a minute and make sure that, at least for the baseline of what we'll be talking about today and the way that NBI had to select some vocabulary in order to put forward our research and results, we use terms regarding energy. When we talk about the energy of a building, we mean every energy use that goes into the building, be it gas, steam, liquid fuel, etc. So the energy use of a building is the sum of all its energy. And the term net is the formula whereby a year or more of the on-site renewable energy production is totaled, and then the total energy use, the gross energy use, if you will, is then deducted to see if the energy use from renewables exceeds the energy use by all fuels. Two other terms that you'll be seeing in this presentation are verified and emerging buildings. Verified meaning that we have a documented performance independently looked at by MBI or a close ally in terms of performance at net zero. And emerging meaning they may not have got to net zero yet, but they're on the path to get to zero energy. Lastly, in the energy performance section, I'll mention EUI, which means energy use intensity. It's a metric of energy performance, most common metric in our industry, and it's kilo BTUs per square foot per year, where all the energy is made into BTUs, and then we look at it on a square foot basis. So this helps us levelize all the building energy into a comparison across building types. And let's get into the fun, interesting parts of naming names. What's really fantastic about MBI's work and our story collecting about what's going on in net zero buildings, zero net energy buildings, is that we name names. No other database is as large as MBI's that collects the exact building, the characteristics in terms of square footage, the owner information, and then the data regarding its energy use. So then this can serve for you and others and policymakers as well to show where are the buildings, who's building them, what like buildings. If you're a design team member, you want to say, where can I find somebody who's done a retail building? You can find it in this list that I'm going to share the big picture results from. The first part that comes to mind when we talk about what's going on with zero net energy buildings, we talk about looking at the trends over time. So on the left part of the screen, you see that the time zone since MBI has been collecting this data. We began in 2012 with our first study, and I could name about 60 buildings. And today we have actually 500 or more. We have 482 documented in the report you can get on the online, and you can see that 67 of those are verified and 415 of those are emerging. But in the graph on the right, you see it by completion year, a little different than when we found them to put them on our list, which is the graph on the left. You see the trends of when buildings were being built, and you see a very steep curve in the last 5 years of attention to zero net energy and the growth in zero energy buildings in terms of completion. Then what's really exciting too is that we have documented zero energy buildings in every climate zone across the entire US and Canada. We've got very leading states like California naturally, who had the most advanced policies the earliest. So they have the largest amount of zero energy buildings. But we have a lot of growth, and that's what the section down here is. This year, for the first time, we've taken regional attention and looked at a trend in time over regions. We're seeing great growth in the Northeast, the Southeast, and even some emerging buildings in the Southeast part of the US, where we used to have little to no activity 4 or 5 years ago. So you can look up by region, by state, and even a little deeper graphic on the right where you can look into the clusters that are happening in more of the urban areas. Then another trend that also parallels more market trends is that on the left, that tend to be the older buildings, the buildings that have been around 10 years or so, where we've gotten verified data, were smaller, mostly public buildings and mostly smaller size buildings in the 20,000 and less square feet. Now we have a large percent, 40% of all of our buildings and 88% of the total square feet is over here on the right-hand side of the graph in buildings that are 50,000 square feet or larger. So that shows a trend that's picking up more market-sized buildings. And we're also having a fantastic trend with many of you on the phone being practitioners that are moving these buildings forward, designing them, advocating for them with your clients. And we have 70 mechanical firms on the list and 101 architect firms. So growing the tribe of buildings and practitioners that design those buildings is an important part of changing the market. Now about building types. As I said, it used to be primarily public buildings, and you saw some trends towards larger buildings, but schools is still the #1 building type. And my colleague here, Riley Loveland, who's going to speak at the end of today, she's been diving deep into the schools marketplace. So while schools represent 37% of our zero energy buildings, and you can see the breakdown below where K through 12 schools are 50% of those, we're having great growth in diversity of building type, with a high increase in multifamily, commercial type if there's 4 or more buildings connected in multifamily. It becomes into the commercial sector. And I'm showing just the top types of buildings, but we have over 15 building types that have reached zero energy performance or are emerging. And as I said, that with the larger buildings coming in, we're seeing more private sector growth. And this is one of my favorite stories about ZE and one of the most compelling, I think, market transformational statements. Although zero energy buildings are still a tiny part of the market and we've got to make it transcendent to be across the entire marketplace, the fact that we have over here in this left section, 26% of the 500 buildings are for-profit private, and this 46% here are all private sector. That's a fairly flipped image from 10 or 15 years ago, where the early emerging buildings were universities and nonprofits. And on the right, you see also this steeper curve in the red. That's for-profit buildings starting to take the lead in terms of new buildings that are getting started. So I love that the private sector is paying attention, and we're going to continue to try and get that attention and advance those buildings. So what about performance? How low can we go? In zero energy, the lowest number wins, because you want to get your energy use down to low so that you can then replace that amount of annual energy use with your renewables on site. So zero energy in the verified buildings have a median EUI that I mentioned earlier, energy use intensity in kBTUs per square feet of just 18. And compared to the average office in America, that is quite a reduction, about 60% less energy here. And even often people say, well, those are a lot of older buildings in that data set. But if you look at one of the most advanced codes in the country, Title 24 in California, it's still 46, almost half the energy use of brand new best code building. So when we say that codes are advancing and there's not much margin left, these owners, these designers, these buildings are demonstrating the margin still exists at almost 50% savings potential over code. And the same is true for emerging. Emerging are, some are measured performance and some are design targets, but they are also targeting and resulting in energy use in the gray band that is 50 to 70% less than standard practice. So in the closing of this section, I want to mention a couple new collaborations MBI has, especially regarding collecting data and registering projects as zero energy. We're partnering with the International Living Future Institute, and we're going to have a collaborative certification program and a joint portal here on the left. We'll be bringing that out into the market in a few months, later this spring, we hope. And on the right side of your screen, we're talking to ResNet, and we've formed a collaboration to work with the Residential Energy Services Network. They've done over 200 million homes in terms of a HERS rated system for energy efficiency. And we're going to work with them to move that into the database for zero energy documentation of the residential sector as well. So your role in getting to zero is to both improve your skills, your knowledge by attending things like this, but also we have a new resource hub, and you can see on the left a whole lot of things that are there available to you. You definitely should be on the action bulletin. It comes out quarterly, tells you everything that's going on in this field that we can gather and put into a short bulletin for your attention. A number of case studies, a number of resources, and still, when you're looking at data like this, if you know of a building that's even in the planning stage, in the design stage, under construction that might not be on our list, please register it. Share your story and get your building on there. We'll be having our every other year Getting to Zero National Forum in April in Pittsburgh, and would love you to join us. Fantastic dynamic event, very design team focused, have the energy managers from efficiency programs, government policies, probably the most diverse range of attendees, and really focused in on moving buildings to zero and beyond buildings at the community level, at the policy level, beyond the building into the grid aspects. There's tracks on a lot of different topics you can find on the website. So I'll just quickly see if Connie has any questions particular to what I just spoke about before we move to a little bit of trench information from John Andary on the Integral Group's work in building design.
Okay, just a quick note, we will be sending out a link to this recorded webinar tomorrow, along with the PDF of the slides that our presenters are using. So if you or a colleague has registered, you will receive all that information tomorrow afternoon. So we do have a couple questions here. So oops, I lost my place. So is there a reason why the numbers of emerging ZE projects do not translate into equal numbers of verified buildings 2 or 4 years later?
Great question, and definitely a struggle in the industry. Yeah, there isn't a smooth or linear path from having a ZE target to resulting in an actual ZE outcome. The reasons for that variation often have to do with the modeling assumptions versus actual operational events, such as weather differences compared to the model, occupancy hours, density of occupants. Those are the three most common reasons it wouldn't translate. The next most common one that doesn't have to do with changes from design assumptions to actual is operational. A lot of the actual meeting a target has to do with the operator and the occupant activity within the building. Set points for equipment, the control set points, so commissioning, making sure there's a translation of what the designers had in mind with what the operator is doing. Those are the refinements that we need to do to get to actual outcomes. And it can take years, or it can just take a while to get that commissioned.
Okay, and then a specific education question here. What is your opinion on why education is taking the lead?
Oh, great question, and I'll chime in if you want. They're publicly owned buildings, and they have a longer time frame for decision making and the ability to look at their building on a 30 to 50 year time frame as an asset for the community. And because it's a longer time building and they have bond funding, they're able to better levelize their investments across a financial pro forma that's different than a private sector investor that might do a 5 or 7 year flip. Also, educational buildings, they should be leading. They're our most important forward-looking structure in all of our society, because you have the intersection of parents, teachers, and students, next generation, people in every field go to schools to get their children, go to schools for community events. This is where we can really make ZE transparent. So I think the public districts that are leading with that recognize that's an important leading by example sector.
I would add too, this is Riley from New Buildings, that school buildings are generally a replicable building type. So we have 3 schools in Oregon here that are being built to zero energy and in theory zero net cost as well. So they've taken one success story and moved it through the district. I mean, Kathy kind of touched on this too, that the curriculum can be really tied to the building too, so that they're the center for STEM or now STEAM education, which is another reason that educational buildings are really catching on.
Yeah, good point, Riley. As she said, with the replicable building type, they're not high rises, so you're not as, you have much more roof area and campus area to help accomplish your zero energy on a large footprint. Thanks, Riley. All right, anything?
Yeah, we have another one, definition clarification. Are ZE buildings required to retain the RECs to be considered ZE?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole, but the answer is yes. Okay.
Okay. Did you want to take any more now?
No, I'm just a few here that were specific to that section where we'll have a Q and discussion period after the end of the presentations. Thank you all. I'm going to move to John's section, introducing John, and I can hear you coming on. Derek.
Hello. Hey everyone. I'm gonna present a couple of case studies today of a couple of emerging zero energy projects that are just at the completion of construction. So let's go to the first one, and I'm going to call this one zero energy at zero cost. I think this is kind of what everybody's interested in when we bring up the idea of a zero energy project. zero energy target for a project, they go, well, what's it going to cost me? So I'm going to give you a couple examples here that focus on cost. Next slide. Okay, the first one is an education building. It's for the University of California, Merced campus. It's actually in the town of Merced. It's not on the physical campus where the university is. It's a building that is an administration building for the university, and they wanted it out in the town as a sort of a welcoming folks to the town and the university. It's about a little over 70,000 square foot, 3-story building. Go to the next slide. So first thing to understand about Merced is that it's a really hot place. It's sort of in the Central Valley, kind of a desert area, California. Although the average summer temperature gets up to 96, you can see that it's actually in the well over 100 much of the summer months in this location. And it doesn't get too cold there in the winter, but you do get temperatures in the 30s pretty regularly. Just give you a sense of what it's like in that location. Kind of a dry place, but very hot. So focusing on issues of cooling and the energy use required for cooling. Next. So the university had a number of different energy targets that they were thinking about trying to hit for this project. And so on the left, we're comparing this to sort of the baseline, which was the California Energy Code Title 24 at the time. And so the university, all the way to the right, if the EUI were 23, that would represent sort of the most stringent target that they would have. If this building were on the campus of the university campus, then we would have had to have hit this 23 target. Instead, we were shooting for the one in the middle, 27.5, which is what the university came up with as a whole building EUI exact target. However, just to the right of that, you'll see that to hit net zero on this 3-story building, just using the roof of the building for the PV to produce energy, we would have to be in the 25, 26 range. And I'll explain that a little bit in a minute. So go to the next slide. So to get the energy use down, the first thing we did was focus on the envelope of the building, and thinking about the kind of heat you've got in this climate. And what you're looking at here is what our daylight modeling and simulation team did is they looked at annual radiation on the 2 worst facades of the building, the south on the right and the west on the left. This building sits on a block in Merced where essentially it takes up the entire block. So we didn't have a whole lot of options in terms of the shape of the building. So we have this big, long, south facade, big west facade. And so go to the next slide. And one of our strategies was to use an external shading structure to control the sun on those facades and reduce our cooling loads for the project, and in turn reduce energy use associated with cooling for the project. And so this kind of a shading device on the west and south sides did a great job of reducing that annual solar radiation on the skin of the building. But this project was a firm fixed price project that had a budget that we had to meet. And so these kind of shading structures can be expensive. Go to the next slide. And I'll explain how we paid for those structures in a moment. The second thing we did with the skin of the building, with the envelope of the building, is we put a clear story on the roof. You can see this is a big clean roof with set up for PV. There's no mechanical equipment up there. All mechanical equipment is in the building or adjacent to the building on grade. So we got a nice clean roof for PV, so we can maximize the PV use. And then we popped a clear story up in there to bring light down into the building, into the center of the building, so that we could have the lights off, obviously, in the building as much as possible to save energy, and also to just enhance the quality of the environment in the building by bringing more controlled daylight into the building. Go to the next slide. This was another daylighting analysis that will show you the difference between what it's like for a building without the shade structure and no light well in the center. And you can see how kind of bright it is out by the glass and dark it is in the middle. Go to the next slide. Keep your eye up to the upper left here, and you'll see the kind of the difference in the quality of the environment when you can bring that light in, that controlled light in, and controlling the light on the facade. So this is sort of neutralizing the solar heat gain at the facade, but allowing those that, especially on the south side, that shading device actually bounces soft light into the space, bringing it in from the middle of the building, and able to turn the lights off many more hours of the year. And you have a better quality space as well. So go to the next slide. And here's a picture that was recently took. We don't have our professional photographs yet, so this was just one from the design team was there for the grand opening of the building and snapped a couple shots. So these aren't exactly the greatest photos, but they will give you a sense of what it's like inside the building with this really nice light well there to bring that balanced light into the space. Go to the next slide. And again, this was the grand opening, so that's why it's not a professional photo. But this is what the building looks like from the exterior, and you can see the shading devices out there, the shading screens on the exterior, on the south and the west sides of the building. Okay, so go to the next slide. Now let's talk about sort of the energy and the dollars and cents of this. So way we hit our target. What we decided to do was, so we looked at a conventional HVAC system, which was, you can see sort of the second from the right graph, conventional HVAC system, which was our sort of baseline to compare against. It wasn't meeting the 27.5 target that the university had hit, that we had to hit. Even with the shading device, we couldn't hit that target. Same with a fan coil system. The only system, HVAC system, after we had already done all this great work on the skin, that would hit the target was a radiant cooling and heating system. So piping in the slabs of the building, doing your cooling and heating of the spaces with a DOAS fresh air system to bring ventilation air into the building. That actually got us past the target of 27.5 down to where we could hit the zero energy target at 26. Essentially what could be produced from the roof of the building. So that was the target. Then we started working with this radiant design and with those shading devices. Go to the next slide. And we recognized there was a tremendous energy savings. So what we're doing here on the left side of the screen is we're unlike a lot of life cycle analyses. What we're doing here is we're not just comparing an HVAC system with another HVAC system. We're comparing on the left side of the left image is the standard HVAC system and no shading devices. Compare it to a radiant low energy HVAC system and the shading device on the exterior. So that we could compare both the architectural and engineering strategies together to see how we're doing energy wise. And as expected, substantial annual energy savings. Go to the image on the right here, and what we found with that is that the HVAC system with the exterior shading devices was $600,000 less than the HVAC system without the shading devices, the standard HVAC system, the simple VAV and reheat system. So that $600,000 first cost savings is what we used to pay for the shade structure. It didn't exactly work out perfectly. The shading structure was still a little bit more expensive. So to hit our target budget, the architect went back to the drawing board and looked at the program and was able to take a couple thousand square foot out of the building and still hit the program, so that we could keep hit these really low targets, hit the zero energy target, have the quality of a building that we wanted, but hit the final budget numbers. So, but the idea here was to trade the architectural strategy for a reduced cost in engineering system costs. Go to the next slide. And we call this cost transfer. We use this simple graphic on the left to represent this, and this is something we try to do on all of our projects, where if we try to focus on simple, cost-effective, low-cost mechanical solutions, that we can get to that solution by doing a better job on the architecture of the building. So transferring sort of the budget out of mechanical and electrical systems into the architecture of the building is our sort of strategy, typical strategy to hit these zero energy targets. And then on the right side of the screen, you see that there was a life cycle cost analysis done, and it equated to, in over a 30-year period, it generated almost $700,000 in net present value for the owner, or $9 a square foot. So they were very happy about this, and go to the next slide. That the project just opened, and we're going to start to measure that building and hopefully hit our net zero target. The PV for that building is a zero first cost, provided with a power purchase agreement, a third party that comes in, puts the PV on the roof at zero first cost. So that's how we got to zero energy at zero cost. The next example is, I call it go zero energy and save $1 million. And so go to the next slide. A little better than zero cost. We're going to save $1 million. So this is a 87,000 square foot medical office building, 3 stories. It's in Santa Rosa, California. Go to the next slide. Another image of the sort of the backside, so you can get a sense of what this building is like. This is a medical building with doctor's offices and exam rooms and a pharmacy, and a straight up medical office building for Kaiser Permanente. Go to the next slide. Santa Rosa is a little milder than the other project site. Still, it's in California. It's a dry climate, warm summers, so this is a cooling dominant climate, but pretty similar in the winters. You're getting into the 30s and 40s, but not quite as hot in the summer, but definitely cooling dominated. Next slide. The first thing we did was we had a significantly sized site here to put the building in, so we oriented the building on an east-west axis because we had a choice, and made it as long and narrow as it made sense for the program going in the building, and on the east-west axis, because we know it's easier to control the sun if you have predominant north and south facing facades and smaller east and west facades. So that's the orientation of the building. Next slide. And the first thing we did with this, as similar to the previous project, was let's look at the envelope of the building and tune up the facade so it makes as much sense from a design perspective, an aesthetic perspective, an energy perspective. One of the important parts of about this project is it was a really tight budget that the owner was trying to hit, and so every place that we could find to save dollars in first cost, we took it. And in this case, you see, for example, on the south side of the building, on the south facade, very small window wall ratio. And that's because on the other side of those windows are just doctor's offices, small 100 square foot doctor's offices. You don't need a lot of glazing to daylight a doctor's office or to give them a view to the exterior. So it's really tuned, the facade is tuned for the program behind that facade. On the north side, we've got stairwells where you see lots of glass. There are stairwells that are not even conditioned spaces, and some conference rooms that have a little more glazing on the north side, where we don't have the issue of over solar heat gain on the north side of the building. So we could have a little more glazing there, and it made sense from a cost perspective, first cost perspective, and an energy perspective. So go to the next slide. The next thing we did was we focused on the HVAC systems. And what they typically do with these medical office buildings, in almost every instance, is if it was, in this case, it's such a simple building, you would typically see 2 rooftop cooling units, boilers, and then those units are in cooling mode all year, and then we're just reheating that air at VAV boxes around the building to do both heating and reheating if required in those spaces. So pretty inefficient. You're heating, you're cooling, and you're heating at the same time. Not a great way to hit a net zero target. Go to the next slide. Instead, we did something that we call thermodynamic zoning. One of the ways that we think about zero energy projects, like the previous project, is how do we make them all electric? So we're not burning any fossil fuel in the building. Then when the PV is offsetting the energy use of the building, it's actually offsetting all of that electricity, and could turn into a zero energy cost at some point, annual energy cost, because you're offsetting all that energy. You don't have an additional gas bill. So the client had never done an all-electric building before, but we proposed this and said, look, we can put heat pumps up on the roof. Instead of 2, we could put 5 smaller ones, because we reduced all this glazing on the facade and reduced the cooling loads significantly. We'll put 5 units up there, and each one provides either heating or cooling. So we're not cooling and then reheating that air. We're not simultaneously heating and cooling. We're either doing cooling or we're doing heating based on the orientation of the space. So we put these heat pumps, in the north, east, south, west, and in the interior of the building. And so this is the strategy to get to an all-electric building and simplify the building significantly and reduce energy. So go to the next slide, and we'll see how this applies to the actual floor plate of a building like this. So this is your sort of kind of typical medical office building on the south side, as I mentioned before. Very tiny, small doctor's offices, don't need a lot of glazing, and you've got a bunch of exam rooms on the interior of the space. So we just set it up so that you had, because the orientation of the building was simple on an east-west axis, and we could simply put 5 units in here and serve each of these facades. Then when say on a cold day, you might be in cooling on the east side of the building in the morning because you are getting some sun on that facade, and the west side might be in heating because it's a cold morning, it's not getting any sun. Fine, we're not doing simultaneous cooling and heating. We're heating and cooling where we need to, and only where we need to. So go to the next slide. The other thing we did that complements this idea of the thermodynamic zones is we did what we call thermal diffusers, or thermofuser is a manufacturer of these devices, and each air diffuser in each space is its own variable air volume device. Instead of having VAV boxes scattered around the building, we have just these diffusers in each space that actually control the amount of air based on the temperature in each space. And this works great for a medical office building because it's such a transient building. You have the doctors are in their offices for a little while, then they go off to an exam room, then they're back in their offices, and the exam rooms are occupied for a little while, then they're empty, and then the next patient comes in. So this kind of system can react very quickly to all the transient nature of a building like this with all these little individual offices. Saves energy and is more comfortable for the occupants of the building, and kind of simplifies the whole building HVAC design. Go to the next slide. So in our perspective, this was a design assist project. We had a contractor on board early, and so the contractor, we're trying to build a very cost-effective building. The contractor thought, this is the lowest cost way to design these buildings. The first method I explained, VAV reheat with boilers and a bunch of piping all around to do this reheating all over the building. Most mechanical subcontractors would say that is the cheapest way to build a building. But what we realized was that it's actually a complex way to heat and cool a building. And when we saw their cost estimate for this, and we proposed the heat pump strategy, go to the next slide, we realized that it was really a lot simpler. There's a lot less stuff in the building. There's a lot less of everything, especially that piping to all around the building, which is very expensive. Pipe fitters are some of the highest paid workers on site. And so we eliminated all the piping on the project, all of the natural gas to the building, we eliminated completely, and we used heat pumps for everything. And this dramatically simplified the building and reduced the first cost, go to the next slide, by over $1 million. This is a spreadsheet from Turner Construction, the construction company that we were working with on this project. And so down in the corner there, you see that the $1,024,000, that's the actual savings to go from the original, what was considered the lowest cost, first cost HVAC system to the heat pump, thermodynamically zoned system that's all electric that we were proposing with a $1 million savings in first cost on the project. Go to the next slide. And significant savings in energy and energy use to get us to our net zero EUI target. In this case, we just wanted it to be as low as possible to hit the net zero, because the PV was going out into the parking lot. We weren't constrained by the roof of the building. The PV was going in the parking lot. So there was some flexibility on where this EUI could be, but from where we were at the basic baseline code building, we save roughly 50% energy use in our modeling of the all-electric heat pump version of the building that was also saving $1 million first cost. Go to the next slide. And here you can see the building, a rendering of the building with the PV in the parking lot. So again, this is zero first cost PV because it's from a power purchase agreement, a third party that comes in and installs the PV and sells the energy to the client, in this case, Kaiser Permanente. And in most cases for them, they make sure that these power purchase providers are, not only is it zero first cost, they're selling the energy to the client at lower rate than the utility company, in this case, PG&E. The rate is lower than they would be paying for electricity to the local utility company. So it's a win-win-win all the way around financially. Next. And so this is the image. This building is about to open for business. This was taken just a couple of weeks ago on the site. You can see the PV and the building in the background. Again, no professional photographs yet, but a building that's just about ready to open its doors so we can start measuring for zero energy performance. Next. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. I know that everyone on the phone appreciates getting to see what a leading design firm has done, and many of the people on the phone may have some similar examples, but that's just astounding, and it's what is making the changes that we're seeing in the greater marketplace. So stay on, because we're going to do just a couple of minutes on the snapshot, as was told in the representation of this webinar. We're going to give a snapshot on code and policy drivers, then we'll have some more question and discussion with John. I'm going to move into this section regarding there's been some shifts in what we thought of 10 years ago, 5 years ago, in terms of zero energy buildings. And we now think in terms of complementary policy elements, that in order to move a policy forward that's going to advance zero energy buildings, you have to have this trifecta of areas where the building is energy efficient, optimized. You've got to be thinking about the storage and grid interactions, the building with the grid, as well as the grid issues in terms of distributed generation and time of use, and the renewable energy generation. So it's a different dynamic than it was when the building was just kind of an isolated island. It's very interactive now. And in terms of policy, one of the leading state in the country and one of the leading entities in the world in terms of putting in place date certains for change in energy use is California. And you can see how they've got set goals for 2020 for residential here and 2030 for commercial new construction. So this is a policy driver, and it's also one that, even though it may be in California, it's become a model many other entities are using for how to advance their codes and policies. And one of the biggest changes that's happening in our industry is the switch from codes as a mechanism to improve a building efficiency to the need to look beyond the occupancy of the building into the operational side. Because what you're seeing here is the amount of energy systems that are regulated by code by market type. And you see a great deal regulated where there's a lot of large systems in restaurants and supermarkets and hospitals, but the proportion of unregulated loads is growing, and the proportion of related energy use of those unregulated loads is also growing as we move the code better and better towards increased efficiency at the code level. The amount of energy used by unregulated loads is increasing. So you can't get to zero if you don't address both. And this is a slide showing the code progression that includes renewables. And you can see that, again, we have the regulated loads in orange, and the code progression can push those down, but you don't see as much movement here in the blue bars, which is the unregulated loads. We've got to get a handle on ways to post-occupancy continue to have both systems, operational practices, and occupant engagement that will reduce that down to get the actual performance to meet the design intent. And then the PV in the orange can take it down to zero or better than zero. You may have heard about the duck curve. We've got to be cognizant of the fact that to generate a ton of renewables in the middle of the day only helps the middle of the day. In the absence of storage, that excessive load that's, or, you know, good load that's coming from solar renewables for the most part feeds into the building and usually can exceed a building load in a place like Merced or Santa Rosa, any warm climate with sufficient PVs. It's going to be feeding back into the grid. The grid's going to be challenged to distribute that excess energy at a time when other people are generating renewables and nobody's given back into the grid up here in the shoulder season, shoulder time of day in the evening and early evening and evening time. So a lot going on in this area of time of use and shifting both price signals and technology mechanisms to flatten out the belly of the duck. So the key policies, if you're going to work in that area, and many of you on the phone do, that can support moving zero energy buildings forward are listed on the left. Again, we have a policy tracker here. Riley's going to speak next on a couple states and city efforts, and she tracks these policies as best we can keep track of a very increasing dynamic of advancements towards zero energy. And the map on the right is a brand new metric that MBI introduced based on something Charles Ely developed years ago called the Zero Energy Performance Index. And we're just began the rating of state policies. And ACEEE, who rates energy efficiency programs and gives states ratings of how they're doing in their energy efficiency, is now going to adopt this as a comparison metric of how a state is doing towards zero energy policies on this metric. So Riley's going to speak a couple slides, then we'll go to questions.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So as Kathy mentioned, I maintain this database or tracker to track the top programs, policies, codes, and other programs that cities, counties, and states are using to get to zero. On this first slide, you'll see these top states that have implemented some of these policies and codes that are driving the market transformation. Many of these have done things like passed executive orders or have adopted codes or stretch codes to drive energy savings in buildings. And you'll see in the bottom here that this map is on that Getting to Zero resource hub that Kathy mentioned earlier, and it shows the advanced policies that we have tracked. So although many states are driving the zero energy movement, the local level is really where all of the action is. So there are many different avenues that are being taken by these localities to get to zero energy, and they generally fit into 3 buckets. So the first one here is carbon neutral policies, where 37 cities are targeting carbon neutral. The second is zero energy buildings, and 11 cities have zero energy ordinances or policies, and even more have a stated goal of getting to zero energy. You can see them listed here. And the last one is 100% renewables. So 4 cities currently have goals for energy to be supplied by 100% renewable energy by a certain target date. So this avenue is gaining a lot of traction, and more jurisdictions are looking into this kind of clean energy future. And the important thing to note here is that these 3 buckets are distinct, but that many cities have policies that overlap 1, 2, or 3 of these buckets to employ this well-rounded zero energy or zero carbon program. And this table on the right here is an example of the ZEPI score that Kathy just explained a little bit ago. And one thing to note is that we are constantly updating this database or tracker and are always looking for more information about states and cities that are getting to zero, counties included. So if you have anything you'd like to add, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is riley@newbuildings.org. And that's it. Thanks, Kathy.
Welcome. Let's get a chance for Connie to bring forward any folks for John, questions to John especially, and get the dialogue going with those of you that are out there doing the good work.
Okay, we had a question that directly relates to what Riley was just speaking to. Are the executive orders only for state-owned buildings?
You know, it depends on the state. Some states have it for state-owned building, then some start with state-owned buildings and then go, you know, statewide or move through different building types. So it kind of depends on the specific one. And if you want more specifics, feel free to email me.
Okay, and this is probably for all 3 of you. Have you seen a change in willingness of building owners to embrace newer technologies, for example, all electric, or other low EUI design engineering practices? And what does it take to overcome that reluctance and risk aversion? Is price sufficient?
Go ahead, John.
You know, that last example I gave you, the all electric design, it was new to that client, but you know, it's if anybody here from the Southeast is on the phone, I used to practice in Florida. We used to do this all the time. It's not new to anybody there. It just happens to be new to this client, and so sometimes I think what we end up doing, I certainly do, and when I'm in the room with a client the first time, and you know, neither of those projects, the client said, hey, this has to be a zero energy building. It was our proposal that we shoot for zero energy, and I make the proposal by saying, you know, if it doesn't cost you anything, can we shoot for zero energy on this? And they're like, yeah. And so, you know, that gets the ball rolling. And if it's a new technology, the Merced had never had a, you know, radiant building before. But we've designed many of them. I personally have designed, I don't know, close to 1 million square feet of these kinds of buildings, radiant, cool, and heated. So the thing is education and you know, have them talk to owners of these buildings where we've done this before, and go visit those buildings so that they have a comfort level with it and recognize that you know, none of this is really totally new. You know, it's just using it in a different, more creative way sometimes. So that's how I get owners to buy into, you know, something that they haven't tried before.
So this question is for John. What are some of the examples of electrical cost transfers that help fund the architectural upgrades?
The electrical associated with that little diagram that I showed you, the cost transfer, is really usually associated, the electrical with the HVAC. So with the HVAC, if you're doing a good job on the exterior of the building you're looking at right here on the screen is one of Integral Group's projects. It's called the Packard Foundation. It has a very sophisticated exterior shading system that you can't see in this picture because it's not implemented, but it has a very sophisticated exterior shading system and actually has triple element glazing. All of that ended up reducing the size of the cooling system dramatically. So then, because the cooling system is smaller, you have a smaller electrical feed, to the building, and smaller electrical feed to that, than you would have to that mechanical equipment. That's really where the electrical first cost savings comes in. There's always annual energy savings from a well-designed building like the one you're looking at here that has lots of daylight and you're turning the lights off. That's energy savings, but it doesn't save you first cost. What I'm talking about is the first cost associated with the reduction in cooling and heating equipment. If that makes sense.
Okay, and is there any consideration being given to the potential duck curve mentioned of zero energy buildings during the design process?
Yeah, well, we do have a lot of projects. The two I just showed you were we got into the design of those before the duck curve was really something that we were overly concerned about. I mean, it's not really, the duck curve is not something that any one particular building owner has any control over, on a large scale, because they're talking about a full grid, the entire electric grid in California. However, if the owner was interested in helping to try to solve that problem, they would. The solution has to do with battery storage, and so using batteries to store create your renewable energy from your PV, store it, and using it at different times of the day when it can offset what's happening with that duck curve. That's the idea that is being tossed around, and we're doing on a couple projects at the building scale, but really it's actually a grid scale solution as well. So the state of California is looking at batteries and other means of storage of energy to help solve that duck curve issue.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question, and we had quite a few questions that pertain to the effects of occupant behaviors and plug load measures. And Kathy briefly mentioned occupant engagement. Is there anything else that is being successful in reducing the plug loads and the occupant behaviors in these zero energy buildings?
The engagement with the occupants, just to be real clear about it, has to happen at the design stage, at early design stage. What we do with our zero energy projects, this again, the one on the screen here, the Packard Foundation was a great early example of what we call a plug load study. We went and we measured how they used plug loads in their previous building, in their previous facility, and then developed some options for their purchasing program for when they're moving to their new building to reduce the actual energy total energy use of the plugs, and then made recommendations on how to manage that energy use. So using plug strips that have for example, occupancy sensors attached to plug strips so that it would turn off if you leave your desk. Certain things on your desk would turn off, not your computer, but your monitor and maybe your task light. Those kinds of then management of the plug loads. So it's a process. You have to get with your client. You have to understand how they use energy and then make recommendations and have them buy into it. And then the occupants need to understand how to do this once the building is occupied, but they aren't going to know what to do unless you figure it out early on, and then they follow that that logic.
Yeah. I'll just throw in a quick takeaway for people on this topic, that there's three buckets of of approaches. We did a big study on plug loads. The 3 buckets to approach plug loads are at the building level, with your IT centrally, or behind the outlet itself, which is becoming regulated in some jurisdictions. So at the building, IT and plug. At the system, which is at, as John was saying, at plug loads where certain things are plugged into smart strips, or the settings on the equipment have occupant or night setbacks. That's a system. And then the third approach on plug loads is the occupant approach that John's talking about. And there's generally 2 occupant strategies that have to do with, one has to do with transparency of energy use, either through prompts on your computer or dashboards or things that bring the awareness forward. And then you have to keep that awareness to not get fatigued. And then the other approach with occupants is competitions, is another item that's been found to be effective, like with dorm students or with office workers or with especially franchises where people are in different buildings across an organization, and then they compete on a building level. So there's a lot going on there, but it's still a challenging area because it's the humans that are hard.
But the other thing is, I mean, again, going back to dollars and cents, if you can do this early at the early design stage and get a commitment on the reduction, now it actually affects the total cost of the building, because you can reduce the cooling equipment, the cooling requirements of the building based on a commitment to reduce the energy use and the heat produced by those plug loads. So, you know, great synergy there with cost reductions.
Excellent. Okay, Connie, thank you. Do you want to remind people that everyone who's on the phone, Connie's going to put a survey into place that we really would love to hear from you on these 4 questions. So hang on and go ahead, Connie.
Well, it actually launches as soon as we close out the webinar. So
Okay.
if we can close out and say thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks, Kathy and Riley, for your participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.